I'm Nicola Talent and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts. So women just have a type, don't they?
I suppose they do.
Men are the same though, I'd say, are they?
Men have a type as well, yeah. But yeah, they probably do. Nicola, we all have a type, you know. We like an Al meathead or whatever, you know.
I actually knew you were going to say that again. Yeah. What does that mean exactly?
I'm not really sure, but sort of a kind of a muscular ticko, I suppose. Sort of rugby, rugby playing,
handsome,
sort of
tall, burly.
Yeah, burly, but you know,
bearded.
Yeah, unsophisticated kind of, you know, I think so, yeah. Not likely to talk to you about, you know, more likely to say they had a great time at the GAA match than talk to you about existential philosophy sort of type, no?
Well, I don't know where you came up with that being my type from, but anyway, I get the kind of the physicalities of it, but apart from that, I don't know about the ignoramus bit.
No, not ignoramus, but, you know.
Anyway.
Poets, like not poets or that type.
Like creative types.
Creative types, yeah. Okay.
Unlike me, Natasha McEnroe.
Meathead types. Well, she actually arguably likes a certain type of meathead as well.
She likes
more of a criminal meathead, and no disrespect to the girl.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So she's managed to kind of I mean, how she extricated herself from that relationship with Brian Rattigan actually was quite amazing.
Yeah.
You have to sort of sit back and admire it, how she managed to sort of calm him down and get the new situation to become acceptable.
Yeah. I mean, you have to remember as well that she would have started going out with him at a very, very young age, started going out with Brian Rattigan and Natasha McEnroe. She would have been sucked into that world very, very, at a very young age. And of course, when they were in her very early 20s, there was the height of the Crumlin-Drimnagh feud. She was sticking by him and would have seen a lot of violence. And I think at one point she was actually in bed with Brian Rattigan, and two people burst into the flat they were sharing, and he was shot.
She hid in the bathroom.
So that would have been her young life, I suppose.
Life with a meathead.
Life with a meathead.
A warning to us all.
But so, I mean, by all accounts, she was.
I don't like meatheads, by the way. Just in case anyone thinks.
Allegedly, as journalists say. But so that was her life. She was a very devoted girlfriend, wasn't she? Who always turned up in Brian Rattigan's court appearances, of which there were obviously many as we went through the 2000s.
Well, she moved into his family home and she had a number of children with him as well. So the relationship would have cemented with that, I suppose. And yeah, I mean, was so violent in those days. I mean, he was using a ferocious amount of cocaine, which didn't help probably his quick temper, and ultimately ended up murdering one of his teenage friends.
Yeah, he was initially convicted of murder.
Convicted of murder and then manslaughter.
Then ultimately won on appeal.
Stabbed him to death in an abracadabra takeaway.
He did. So during all this time, obviously there was other court cases involving Brian Rattigan, and ultimately he was convicted of murder, although that was overturned, and he was then put in prison for life at that point. Natasha McEnroe was still a very young woman. If you look at the average sentence for gangland killers in this country, most of them are serving something like 30 years for if you get a life sentence. So she's facing, at that point in 2010 or around then, she's facing, you know, that's what she's facing. She's facing another
life on her own with 3 young children in and out of the prison just to visit him, and that's it. And yeah, she's very young and
she probably didn't fancy that, or who knows? She met somebody that she struck up a relationship with, a guy called Paul Geraghty from Ranelagh, and once she struck up a relationship with him, then Brian Rattigan was told And really what happened then is, it is actually quite shocking, you see.
He went ballistic.
In 2011, she was with Paul Geraghty at home in Ranelagh, and a gunman appeared at the house door, burst in through the house. He had to jump out the bedroom window and escaped. The guy who did it was, or suspected of doing it, was a notorious hitman from West Dublin. He was ultimately convicted of very serious offences not to do with this. I mean, it was regarded as a very, very serious attempt on the life of Paul Geraghty.
So this was a hit ordered by Brian Rattigan while he was in prison serving life for murder.
Yeah.
And ordered, as far as we understand it, because he didn't want his ex-partner to move on.
His partner. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this,
I presume she dumped him before she tried to move on.
Oh, by all accounts she did. I mean, by all accounts she was straight up with him.
Yeah.
But the reality is with these guys, and we've seen it in many cases, you're not allowed to break up with them.
No. I mean, we were talking about a story very similar to this in Limerick recently, April Collins, and when she tried to get out of the relationship she was in with Ger Dundon, again, somebody who very young moved into the family home, had children, and when she tried to move on, then there was
and I mean,
murder.
There's many other cases we can't really go into because of sort of family law reasons. But April Collins is a classic example. I mean, she was straight up with Ger Dundon. I want to move on, which, like, let's be honest, is everybody's entitlement to do if you're.
And I suppose if that had happened in the outside world, it might have been more acceptable. Well, obviously, if it was a joint decision to break up, these guys don't particularly like being told that by their woman that they're moving on. But I think the fact that they're behind bars and Rattigan is there, big long sentence, he needs to be in control of everything on the outside as well. And he proved that from prison. He continued to be in control of his drug business, in control of the decision making around that. And clearly the relationship was something that he thought he could direct and control from prison.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, I can tell you, and I'm not speaking about Brian Rattigan in particular, but these guys, they control a lot of these gangland figures. They control their women, but I mean, they don't operate with the same degree of, what they expect of others. They don't live it by themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think Natasha McEnroe, I felt sympathy for her, actually, I have to say, to be in that position where you cannot make that choice, I think is a tough moment to be in. And by all accounts, quite a strong personality.
Well, she stuck by her decision and she stayed with Geraghty. And did he prove to be a better choice than Rattigan?
Well, I mean, the reason we're talking about all this is because last week he was convicted of money laundering offences. He was convicted in a court in Cork. Basically, the guards gave evidence that they saw Paul Geraghty arrive in Cork on the bus, meet a known drug dealer, and collected an amount of cash, a relatively small amount. Paul Geraghty, at the time, I remember writing about Paul Geraghty when he was first with Natasha McEnroe, we were saying he's no convictions, no involvement in crime. But ultimately, in the meantime, he has been convicted of drugs offences and other offences of a relatively small nature. But the evidence was given last week in court how he was travelling to Cork. He met with a known heroin dealer, collected a sum of money. He was spotted receiving this money in woodies. The police said they were monitoring him, saw him acting suspiciously, pulled him over. So he admitted his offence and pled guilty. So maybe she does have a type, but...
this sounds very small fry, though. I mean, €3,315, plenty to a lot of people, but that's what he was caught with in the city after travelling from Dublin to collect that on the bus.
Yeah.
It's not the high-end sort of individual that Rattigan was to become, even from behind bars.
No, but Paul Geraghty was involved in a sort of drug dealing operation that became very focused on heroin in Dublin inner city at a certain point. That gang that he was associated with became one of the major sort of suppliers of heroin. street dealing heroin in Dublin's sort of inner city. There's money to be made. There's not millions of money. There's nobody retiring to the south of Spain or Dubai on it, but there is a steady trade. He's spoken about in court. It was heard about how he's suffering from an addiction, but yeah, he's convicted now, and you know, that is a certain type of rural drug trade, though, isn't it? That we see that people travelling on buses, dealing in thousands of euros worth of drugs and cash, but not huge sums. But it's definitely...
You look at those sums in comparison to some of the other things we talk about, monies we talk about, and even we were recently looking at the EncroChat press conference, the information that came off that and the seizures, and compared to, 130 tons of cocaine that was seized, there was only about 3 tons.
Yeah, it was 3 tons of heroin, I think, 3.3. Yeah, so it shows.
I mean, that's a minuscule amount compared to what else seems to be going on there in Europe. I mean, these are very crass figures to be looking at the market, but it does seem, if it was a business model, is the bottom falling out of the heroin market. I mean, I know from other anecdotes that there were 0 addicts, being treated in the teen heroin addiction services in the last year. Well, this is the first time ever it was 0.
Yeah, I think there's 2 different things going on. I think the first is that the rise of prescription drugs and associated prescription medications have taken part of that market. So you can see that every day around the city. Some of the people that are really suffering the really sharp end of addiction. It's not always heroin anymore. Some of that is various types of prescription drugs that are accessible on the internet. Some of them are opiate substitutes.
There's a lot of crack out there as well.
There's a lot of crack, but there's a lot of prescription drugs. I mean, there's just a lot of benzodiazepines of various types. I mean, they've become a huge part of the market. There is a steady market for heroin, but it's not the level of growth that you've seen in cocaine. I saw there was a story in one of the papers there about a guy who's running a pub in middle of Galway, and it's called a Schnockta-free pub, and he's going to have no cocaine in there, 0 tolerance and testing and everything.
Right.
Now, the idea that's how widespread cocaine has become in this country and how normalised it's become. But heroin hasn't become like that. It has stayed, in relatively small pockets in certain urban centres.
But it's a different image.
It's a different image, but it's also, that's just the way it's gone. But
I think people probably from new generations using it have seen what addiction to heroin can do. It's not a very attractive drug to kind of gravitate towards nowadays, even though people will try it. Some people will try it and not become addicted. Most people, it does seem to be a very addictive drug. But like cocaine has a totally different image. It's not being injected into your arm down a smelly side alley. It's being used in trendy nightclubs. It's got a cool image. There's no shame attached to it whatsoever. And it's been from the very first days it showed up in Miami. It's been marketed on that cool.
Yeah.
And that's why we're continuing to see the growth.
Yeah, and you've also seen that's like any area, like any business, when there's a growth area, the businesses get involved in it. They want to get a part of that action. A lot of the heroin smuggling, rather than coming from these big scale, smuggling operations from South America, coming in containers and all of that, there's a much smaller kind of mule smuggling from the UK. There's a lot of heroin comes across kind of from the Turkey into Europe. So there's much more sort of smaller operations. There's a lot of people, I think, bringing heroin in on boats from the UK. But there doesn't seem to be the same investment in that trade. But that's not to say that there's not a big business here. And there are a lot of people, Cork is an interesting example in this case, because there's a lot of people, they always say, getting buses into Cork on a daily basis with maybe a few €1,000 worth of heroin, and that becomes a little a business that's very hard to stop and very hard to police in a way. But it seems
and it's not as available in the rural country, every country town areas.
It's not. Though there have been, of course, as well, some Eastern European gangs that have made it their business to be moving heroin into sort of parts of rural Ireland, have become kind of street dealing. I mean, they were known as the Russians, even though they were primarily not from Russia, but from other parts of other parts of Eastern Europe. They were just, that's what the name they got. And there was exposés on them and convictions ultimately across Europe to do with that. So it's that market, I think, has changed. And there is actually an interesting report, actually, which you might look at about heroin use across Europe, how that has changed. You might look at that.
Oh, yeah, definitely. That would be very interesting to look at that one. As Geraghty goes into prison, of course, Rattigan is out.
Yeah.
And he's a free man.
Yeah.
And he seems to be very much back in business around the Basin Lane area in particular, which is the sort of centre of his control.
Yeah, he was spotted, of course, coming back into the country in recent weeks, as reported in the Irish Independent. Came back in, it was reported with a black eye.
Right.
And was asked by, what was he doing back in Ireland? He's looking after business. So
there's been a few reports since he was released that he's been kind of back around, making very public gesturing around those sort of stronghold areas. But he's flitting in and out. He's not staying put. He's not really comfortable here in Ireland. He obviously feels under threat.
Yeah.
And he is suspected, or has been reported, of being in the company of John Gilligan in Spain, in the Alicante region.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's no doubt that in terms of the guards, they regard him as being an active criminal figure for sure, and that there is also going on in Dublin and around Ireland. There is a bit of a vacuum as the kind of control of the drugs trade dies off, and so there are opportunities for these guys. But yeah, Paul Geraghty won't be one of them. He'll be behind bars. By all accounts, Natasha McEnroe, managed to resolve that situation and eliminated the threat against Paul Geraghty's
life. That was extraordinary that she was able to do that. I mean,
yeah, it was.
She obviously and has remained in, good relationship essentially with Rattigan, father of her children.
Well, I think, I mean, we don't know exactly. That's what we hear, and she's a good survivor, I think it's fair to say.
For sure. Okay, Niall Donald, thank you very much.